Okay, welcome to the next seminar on governance. In this session, we're going to talk about the models of governance, the purpose of governance, and what you need to do to ensure that you have governance taking place in your organizations. So this comes from a reading that we've got on governance, which I will post to the course website. Basically, corporate governance and ISITC governance focuses on several different things. The first thing is control. So we want to try and get a mechanism for control into our organizations where we use our systems to police the things that we need to have managed. So we have objectives that which we want to have successfully completed in our organizations. The next level down for that is accountability and sustainability. We want to be able to create mechanisms or put things in place where people do the things that we need them to do. In an earlier session, I talked about there being policy, and policy having to make sure that it covers and solves a problem. In the earlier session of this module, I posted a mini lecture for you to look at to help you understand that a little bit further. That gives you some content that you can use as you go through this session, and you can go back and take a look at that, and that will show you how we structure policies. But the one problem we have with the policy is it's just law, it's just written down. To get compliance or get people to buy into that, you need to create structures of accountability. So we need things like approval chains. We need to do it for the assessment of corporate health to make sure that the government or the organization or the project that we're managing may remain sustainable and useful for the future. All we're trying to do is reduce the risks, create an approval of allocation of different resources, and accountability for the outcomes. The problem with policy is that it's written law. It's not necessarily process. Governance is the process side of policy, where we take the policy which we've got and place mechanisms around it to ensure that it comes to pass. So we're going to cover this in the face-to-face session. If you're online, you may just want to take notes and write these down and send them to me, and I can talk to you about that. So governance involves several different things. There's steering committees or ruling bodies that are usually in charge of this. A steering committee is a group of people that are considered to be experts or people of authority, where they will be given access to a group of different tasks and issues and be given the responsibility to ensure that it comes to pass. There's different boundaries there between society and the economy, so we don't often know where our responsibility as a corporation or an organization stops and starts and where the others begin. We have to deal with people that govern themselves, things like tribal culture. We have to deal with issues where people don't understand always the importance of policy. But the idea of governance is to steer. The word governance means steering. So steering people towards policy and putting steps in place to make sure that it comes to pass. In traditional literatures and research, it's considered to be steering. So it guides people in the direction they need to go. Policy creates the template, governance creates the steering or the steps that you go through to make sure that it comes to pass. The rule of law is something as well that is important for understanding, but it's the guidance and facilitation of that policy that ensures that it comes to pass, and that's where governance comes in. Here's an example of IBM and how they do governance. So they look at all of these different things. So they look at their services, other governance disciplines, finance, strategy, technology like enterprise architecture, portfolios, risk compliance, data governance, which is what you guys will be doing in the ICLIM project, development governance, operations governance, and so on. But they have a simple four-step approach to governance. First of all is plan, so come up with the policy. The second step to that is implement. So once you create a policy, you begin to implement that policy. So then you have to look at mechanisms for governance. That brings us to the next stage, which is manage. So once you have you worked out what you need to govern or control or steer from the policy, and let's just say it's the data storage aspect of the Pacific ICLIM project, what you then need to work out is, first of all, who are the stakeholders? Once you know who the stakeholders are that are involved, then you have to look at ways of governing those people to make sure that they keep their end of the bargain and do the work they need to do. There are different models for this, and we'll discuss this shortly. But IBM's one is you plan, you come up with the policy, you implement that policy, you put a framework around it or a governance structure around it, you manage it, and then you see how it's worked. There is one fatal flaw in this. There is one fatal flaw in this, as you will note, and that is that these particular things are iterative or circular, so you'll go around and around and around. It's not something that you do immediately. So when you get to the assess stage, you might go back to the planning stage or go back to the management stage. The assessment or the evaluation of the policy and governance structures may reveal something complicated. So governance creates the conditions for ordered rule, whereas information policy creates the policy or the framework for ordered rule. So let's look at some models and frameworks for governance and how they operate. First of all, there's a control model and a stakeholder model. We're going to look at both in this course, and you're actually going to look at, on the policy day, you're going to look at both models. One is hierarchical and the other one is facilitative. So the control model relies on a chain of command of resources. So there's one person that's in control, usually someone called the Chief Information Officer. They have different roles and structures and governance to do, and they have different aspects of that that they have to control and manage. So they are ultimately responsible. Somebody sets the strategy or the policy. It creates a profitable chain of command which we can use, and it goes all the way from the top to the bottom. So if that's you, you're the one who has the final say, and everybody must do what you say. This is the exact opposite of the stakeholder or the facilitative model. This is vertical, horizontal, and social. So what it means is, instead of saying, you will do what I say, you create structures of accountability into roles and into the way people operate to make sure that the policy comes to pass. You have a steering committee or a governance committee that oversees the implementation of policy. And this is closer to where we're at in the majority of non-government and not-for-profit organizations. So we have a group of people that work together as a fiduciary. The word fiduciary means trusted advisor. So we have a body that produces advice, and we then put people in place and empower them to make the decisions themselves. ISIT governing bodies approve the strategy, but it's balanced out. Now, the reason why we're going to do a stakeholder assessment in this course is this is how the majority, if not all, of government organizations work. It will be built on, there will be a chain of command, but it will be built on stakeholder interaction. It may be that someone's outside of your jurisdiction, so you may be in Samoa and you want to talk to someone in Fiji. You have no direct line of command to each other. So you have to learn to negotiate, to mediate, and to walk through the policy implementation process and governance frameworks together. Without that, there is no balance. So you can't actually have that without talking to each other. The majority of cross or international negotiations are done through a stakeholder model. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. These are the two main ones. They usually come down to two. So the stakeholder model relies on goodwill and social mechanisms. The control model relies on command and control, so hierarchy, bosses and things like that. The stakeholder model is how the majority have done. If you look at that word again, fiduciary, it means people who are trusted advisors. They provide advice and people around them take on board that advice. There is one flaw in the stakeholder model, which is massive, and that is assuming that everybody is on the same page or can get to the same page. That's not always the case. So along the way, some compromises might be made. In the control model, there is no room for compromise because there is a clear command structure, there is a clear hierarchy, and everybody knows where they stand in relation to that hierarchy. So some of the sectors you might find the facilitative policy governance model might be in the IP copyright industries because they're cross-disciplinary. There's not necessarily one group of people that manage that. There's lots of different people working together that manage that. In higher education, there are non-linear command structures. So the Vice Chancellor may say he wants something, but underneath that, there's all of these different groups that do not report to the same person. Research industries, you might be doing research in agribusiness or information systems in global economies. If that is the case, then in that particular research, you will not be able to talk to people who are under your command. So you'll have to learn to collaborate. IT services and mass media typically don't have command structures like the ones that we've said before. It might be different areas of media talking to each other. Oops. It might be different areas of media talking to each other. All right, so there's an example there on piracy, which we'll take in class. This is interesting because the European Union adopted this, but now have completely gone backwards from it. Governance mechanisms. So there's several different mechanisms to get governance to work the way that we want it to work. First of all is coercion, which is force. You can force somebody to work with you. You will do as I say. In a command structure like the military, that will work, but in every other organization, you will have problems with that. The reason being is a lot of organizational behavior literature and research suggests that this is not the best way to manage people. Facilitation. Facilitation means doing things together, working on a common goal and a common problem-solving process, and we'll talk about that in later seminars. Leadership, the Steve Jobs model, where one person or a group of people carry the vision, and then they walk around to all the stakeholders, educating them on the vision and getting buy-in. So buy-in means getting people to believe in the vision and getting them to work with you. An inverted structure or reverse governance structure means a grassroots structure. Very rare, but you see this in environmental communities and in some tribal cultures. So you might see this where from the bottom of the group, a group of people get together, want to drive some change, and other people join in. So social media is an example of that. And there are many other different examples of that. So these are just the four main ones that you'll see: coercion, facilitation, leadership, and the inverted structure model, or the decentralized structure model. All of these are good, but you have to figure out in advance when you're implementing something, what is the particular spirit of the movement and who's the group of people that I'm working with at this point in time. If it's not clear who they are and what they're about, is it a coercive environment, a facilitative environment, or is there room for a visionary? You have to play it the way that the people are. And that's the biggest misconception about governance, is that a lot of people simply believe I can tell people what to do. You have to learn the steps in the process to go through in order to be successful. Okay, we will do this exercise in class if we have time. Some other governance frameworks which you may want to consider as a political process, which is voting. So when it comes time to decide on key issues, people may vote. That has its drawbacks as well. Boardrooms or boards is another one. Blood spilt on boardroom floors. When you have boardrooms and a group of people working together in a coherent unit, it can be quite difficult and complex to get them to work together. In that way, there's usually only a handful of people who have power. This is not like a steering committee, which has been given for facilitative rights. The steering committee often doesn't have power to tell people what to do, but a board will have the power. So this is more like a command and control model. Most of the ones that you'll come across when you're dealing with many different institutions are facilitative and political. People form these bonds around strategic necessity because they have to. They form alliances and power bases through that. So there is a critical side to this as well, and that is that there is a political part to this process. People don't agree because they have to, but getting agreement is critical. So negotiation, mediation, and working with people to get them to see and understand what you're doing and then get them on board is a critical part of this process. So what is a framework? And how do you build one necessarily? Well, a framework is a set of logical principles that you use to manage something that's a policy. So you might have a policy on database storage in the South Pacific, for example. That's a very good policy. The framework is how do you get that thing to come to pass? And they call this a control mechanism in the literature. They call it a control mechanism. So it's something that you put in place. It's a series of logical connections and steps and processes that give people a guideline on how to implement this. I've also included a lecture on structuring policy ideas, which goes before this one to give you an idea as to how complex this process can be. So often what happens is people will investigate an issue and they'll report back to the steering committee. They'll write a report outlaying the framework for implementation. People get paid great deals of money for coming up with frameworks for implementation and what they think. So The policy, again, is just the rule of law. It is just the system by which we've decided that we want to fix a certain problem. Policies are best thought of as a problem looking to be solved. So what the governance framework does is that it solves that issue, solves that critical issue, and it makes it so that it wasn't a problem necessarily anymore. So on one hand, again, you've got the policy part. The policy is the ideas or the problem we wish to solve, but the governance framework, or the framework, are the steps through which we will solve it. So we have a look at this here. This is an example framework that I came up with many years ago. So the process works like this. First of all, we have the complex issue down the bottom there, so that arrow going up there. We want to create, so the board of directors or policymakers discover an issue. It feeds back into a framework to manage policy, and then we create mechanisms to make the policy work and be managed. And that's usually what actually happens. But what should happen is the process should improve and feed back to the board of directors, but quite often it doesn't. The reason for that is that steering committees quite often are temporary and governance roles are temporary. People come, people go, and a lot of information is lost. But the idea is quite simple, that when the problem or the policy issue is found, a policy is created, but then a framework and mechanisms must be put in place to manage that policy. Okay. We will cover this one in class in the afternoon session in our case study implementation on the third day. Thank you very much.